Good morning, everyone. This is Fred Zabonik. I work for Asset Management Services. I am in the general services of DAS. We'll go through a couple housekeeping things and some organization before we get started here. So one of the things that if you're not aware of already, is that everyone attending the webinar is muted. Okay, so if you have a question, you should enter it within the go-to site. And Michelle Williams is also on the line. So she is helping to conduct the webinar. And so if she sees something that if you have a question, she will come in and let me know so we can address each question as we go. But right now, all the participants, and there's way over 100 of you right now that are on the webinar, you won't be able to ask a question over the phone. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that that everyone understood that. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you have any coworkers who wanted to attend but they couldn't, if you reach out to Michelle, we'll be able to get you set up or your coworker set up so they can go back in and listen to the webinar so they can get the policy information as well. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, this is an annual requirement that at least one person from every state agency attend and participate in this policy webinar. On your screen, you should see 2017 AM policy webinar, and right underneath that is a very small link. That link is to our the asset management website. And so I am going to go there and pull that up. So on your screen right now, you should see the Asset Management Services website, and I'm scrolling down to the part that was that link there, the Asset Management Handbook, right there under Policies. That is where you would go to find out anything and everything, most things, I should say, about what to do with your inventory, how to record it, how to a lot of the information that we're going to go over this morning, and the document that you should have received. That is a small sample of the entire Asset Management Handbook, but this is where you reference it. And we have, at a minimum, we have an annual update on that. And usually it seems the last few years we've had a couple updates within a fiscal year. Okay, so let's get out of that. Okay, so now on your screen you should see the outline for what we're going to do this morning. So we're going to go over the requirement of the Ohio Revised Code, and that basically tells us what we're supposed to do as state agencies and what DAS is supposed to do. We'll go over some of the policies and the procedures there in number 2, and then we'll go right into the annual certification requirement and the biennial physical certification that is required every other year. Then on number 5, that's a big topic the last couple of years with OBM focusing on audits and what they have sent me some information as far as what they focus on. And that list, when we go over that list, it's not everything in its entirety. However, it's a good chunk of what they look for when they're doing an audit. And see, part of our responsibility, Michelle and I's responsibility, is to inform you as much as possible what the requirements are for your inventory and how you're supposed to treat your inventory, how you're supposed to record it, what needs to be tagged, what doesn't need to be tagged. And so we'll cover that, and that's the OBM audits. That's number 5 there on your screen. Then we'll go over another hot topic is when you can't find your equipment. There's some assets that can't be found during a physical inventory. So we'll go over that, as well as number 7 there of when you're supposed to go ahead and dispose of the assets as being permanently missing. We'll cover on the number 8 there, the employee wrongdoing and suspected illegal activity and what you're supposed to do in that case. And then we'll start to get into the cost thresholds, okay, of personal property and then of real property. And basically that is going to be, hey, I have a piece of equipment, some personal property, and I need to, based off of the cost and what the item is, I may or may not have to record it in the asset system, okay? So we will cover that for personal property, for real property. Then we will go over how to record a capital asset to make sure that you understand, hey, if it's at this dollar amount, it's a capital asset, versus if it's a little lower dollar amount, then it's just a stewardship, it's a normal asset, it would not be considered capital. And the importance of recording capital assets, and I know some of the smaller agencies don't have any capital assets. The bigger agencies have a good chunk of capital assets. And so those are important, because if they get coded and recorded as a capital asset, those dollars and that depreciation ends up going into the state's financial record, the CAFR report, if you've ever heard of that, which OBM, they're in deep right now, because they're in their deadline to get the CAFR report ready, and that's the state's financial package. So it's important to understand what's a capital asset and how to record it, so that the state represents the cost and the depreciation correctly on the annual report. We'll also briefly touch on number 12 there on your screen, the infrastructure assets. We'll talk about briefly construction and progress, and then we'll touch on licensed vehicles, and then the last 3 there, 15, 16, and 17. We've had some questions this last fiscal year about attachments to existing assets. We've also had some confusion on interagency transfers, and then we will go over the custodian policy, because there's been some questions about that throughout the year as well. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover. And another thing, as far as the organization or just understanding what's going on, for the most part, I'm going to be talking the entire time, along with Michelle's help. You may see on the go-to site that it says Tracy Price. Okay, Tracy works for the Oaks group, and we have been able to utilize her sign-on to be able to put this together. So, but as far as sending Tracy an email saying nice job or whatever, Tracy really doesn't have anything to do with the actual webinar, except to help us to be able to get signed on, so we can utilize the go-to site. Okay, so now I am going to go into the actual policy handout. So some of these pages I will kind of briefly touch on, and some I will actually read it word for word, because there's no interpretation other than that. And this talks about, and in the Ohio Revised Code 125-16, it talks about the inventory records for personal property and real property. Okay, and basically the first paragraph gives the Department of Administrative Services the authority to drive the bus on this. Okay, so that is why the folks, managers, our administrator, have delegated that authority down to Michelle and I. In the second paragraph there, that's something I think I should probably read word for word there because it's very important. And it says, on or before the first day of October, immediately following the end of each fiscal year, the officer in charge of each state agency shall cause its inventory activity at the end of that fiscal year to be certified as correct and filed with the director in accordance with procedures that the director prescribes. In addition, the officer in charge of each state agency shall cause a full and accurate physical inventory to be taken and concluded prior to the close of each fiscal biennium. So basically, the first part of that is every state agency, board, and commission must certify their assets, okay? And they end up doing that, and most of you know this, they end up doing that using our web application. They reach out to Michelle, they get a sign-on and password, and then every year the agency has to certify. So I don't want to confuse folks. There are a lot of DNR folks and DRC folks. There's some DAS and some mental health folks. There are the requirement for certifying your annual activity is by agency. Okay, so a lot of you folks who work out in different parts of Ohio, you won't be required to do the certification. You may be asked by your central office folks to do your own certification for them, but as far as our requirement, only one person from each agency will actually complete the certification. And that certification requirement, that is every year. You have until October 1st to do that. And you have between July 1st and October 1st. Okay, what happens with the Oaks folks, the agencies that use Oaks AM, is that the system gets shut down at the end, and most of you are aware of this. OBM will facilitate the timing on this as to when the asset system gets closed, and it's usually that last week in June, some point, 25th, 26th, 24th, something like that. Okay. Then once the Oaks group, the functional teams, once everybody has done their behind-the-scenes work, then what Michelle and I are able to do is to run the year-end reports, and then we have a week or so to be able to get those completed and then posted out on our website. So a lot of times, the first week of July, for the Oaks users, you're going to get something in the email from us, either from Michelle or myself, that will say, hey, your certification reports, your year-end reports have been posted out on our website. And that's the same website that we looked at a few minutes ago. Okay. And then the agencies from there have the option. They can do their certification, July 7th, July 8th. They can do it as early as that, or you have a lot of folks who will wait until the end of September. As long as you file by October or earlier than October 1st, you're in compliance with the law. And so when you get audited by OBM or the auditor of state, that won't be something that they'll have a finding on. That's something that you'll be able to meet the requirement. Okay, so That's the first part, is every year your inventory activity by agency is certified. The second part of that second paragraph is the physical inventory, okay? And the physical inventory has to be done within a 2-year period. Now, as far as reporting your physical inventory to us, again, you use the same web application, but you do not need to certify with us every year that you took a physical inventory. It's every other year, and it happens to be every odd fiscal year. So we just had 2017. We just had fiscal year 17 that we finished this past June 30th. So all the agencies had to do 2 certifications. They had to do the annual inventory activity, and then they also had to do the physical inventory. And as we get through this today, we'll have some screenshots of what that looks like. But those are the 2 requirements as far as the Ohio Revised Code. So now, if we scroll, I'm going to scroll down to, and there's just a small screenshot of what the certification form looks like online, and it has my name up at the top, but that would have whoever is actually doing the completing the online document, and it has different columns for land, buildings, leases, and the equipment. So that's the inventory activity, and you can see you have beginning balances at the top on the far left column. Then you have additions, transfers in, transfers out, retirements, adjustments, reinstatements, and recategorizations, and then you have some other adjustments down at the bottom. And then you have a bottom line. Okay, so that's the annual, and this is the second page of the annual, which is set up just for assets that didn't get entered. If you purchased something and you received it at the end of at the end of June, and the system was closed before you entered it, you would put that information on this second page, and it's called, at the top it says Schedule B. But that, a lot of the agencies get their assets in the system in time, so this is usually blank. But the very bottom has the sign off information as far as either a fiscal officer, as a director, but someone has to sign off that they agree with what has been submitted. That's for the annual inventory activity. This next page I'm going to, page 4, this shows the physical inventory that's done every 2 years. And you see it's a lot less involved. You basically have a date there of when the inventory was conducted. And then you would have, again, the executive officer, who could be your supervisor, could be the fiscal officer. It's whoever you deem to be responsible for this, to being able to sign off. And then you would have the person who actually prepared the document and their title. And that's all that the physical inventory to be in compliance with the law. Okay. So this past year, fiscal year 17, if you took a physical inventory in fiscal year 15, you would not be in compliance with the law. If that was the last one you took, it would have had to be within fiscal year 16 or fiscal year 17. Any of that in that 24-month period, if you took physical inventory, you'd be in compliance with the law. Okay, so now the next time you have to report that you did a physical inventory is not until after fiscal year 19. So sometime this year, fiscal year 18, or in fiscal year 19, you would have had to done a physical inventory in one of those 2 years, and then you would record it as part of your fiscal year 19 requirement. Okay, so now we're on page 5, and here is a list of some of the things that the OBM audit team is looking for when they go out. And I have heard from several agencies that they do an extremely thorough audit. We've had folks that have done or been part of doing inventory at some agencies 20 plus years, and they've never had as thorough of an audit as they have with the OBM audit team. Okay, so some of the things that they're really focusing on, and again, this list is not considered to be everything and anything, but these are some of the main points. That third bullet point there, custodian of an asset, is it correct? They look at that to make sure that, first of all, that it's populated, and second of all, that it's the right person who is in charge or responsible for that asset. One of the other things they look at is they're looking down here for the retired assets to make sure they're properly removed from the inventory. So that goes along, and that's been going on with the auditor of state as well. Basically, they will, they're in a certain area of a facility, and they see something that has an asset tag on it, and then they'll say, okay, show me where this is on your report, because if it has a tag on it, it should be in service, it should be on your active inventory. And then they'll also do the opposite, where they'll say, okay, let me see a report of your assets, and now show me where it is. Okay. Sometimes we will have folks that will get they've got approval from state surplus. They're going to send out their assets, and they're going to retire them. They're going to send them over to state surplus, and they get them ready. And then they go ahead in their asset system, whether it's Oaks or their own in-house system, and they retire the asset. And then for some reason, the equipment doesn't get shipped out to surplus. And we've had some audit findings regarding that, where if that's the case, if you realize something didn't get shipped out to state surplus, what you would do is you would do, at least for the Oaks AM users, you would do a reinstatement. And you would retire. It's basically unretiring the asset in the system and switching it back from disposed status into in service. Okay, so that's one of the another thing that they look at. Another thing down towards the bottom, highlighted there, is the the proper process for employees who are departing the agency to turn in their property, everything that was assigned to them. Okay, and there is an administrative directive that basically says if you're leaving state employment, the agency is responsible for having a process that they make sure they collect all their assets. So someone who's going to another job can't just take something with them. Excuse me. Okay, so now we're into assets not found, and this is a very touchy subject because the state of Ohio will get media inquiries, and they'll get media inquiries. In the time that I've been in charge of asset management services, we used to get media inquiries every summer, every July and early August, because those were slow news months. And throughout the years, that has really changed, especially with the political climate now. And so what the local media, and when I mean local meaning anywhere in Ohio, they usually ask for your missing and your stolen assets. And they'll ask, I think the most I've seen is they will ask for the last 4 years of your missing and stolen assets. So we're going to go through this, and I'm going to read part of this word for word. So in the middle there of assets not found, upon a state employee recognizing that one or more assets cannot be found, the agency shall pursue an investigative review to find the asset. An investigative review may consist of a special review of documents, interviews with personnel, and/or special physical inventory. During this time period, the asset may remain active in the agency's inventory. Okay, so we've had cases where someone at an agency will try to do a physical inventory of a certain area of their facility, and they can't find the equipment. It's not where it's supposed to be, okay? And they automatically will go into the asset system and code it as missing, okay? The policy here is saying that you shall pursue an investigative review. Basically, you're required to do a second physical inventory, okay? Because that item may be in another section, or it may have been moved without your knowledge. It may have been moved off the premises, and it may be found at another facility. So it is your responsibility to do a second physical inventory, try to get coworkers involved, and supervisors involved to try to find the asset. If at that point, so you see there at the bottom of the page, it says that agencies shall determine if a not found asset is or is not permanently missing. The agency shall determine an asset to be permanently missing, then they shall immediately retire the asset on their respective asset systems as missing. Okay, so once you have done the secondary physical inventory, investigative review, that's when you go into your asset system and place the asset as missing. But you don't do it the very first time you try to find it. You have to try again and get more folks involved. There may be some ideas that, hey, it's over here, or hey, maybe it went to state surplus. And, at that point, if you've exhausted all your avenues and you still have no clue where the asset is, then you do code it as missing. Now, the other part of that is if the asset is stolen, or let's go to the top of the next page, page 6. And there it says if the asset is found, if a missing asset is found, you should immediately reactivate the asset in the for the inventory record. So you can do a reinstatement if you're an Oaks AM user, and if you're not an Oaks user, if you're using your own in-house system, you should be able to do something to make that asset active again or in service, so that it accurately reflects your inventory. Okay, now in the middle of page 6 here, we have notification of wrongdoing. Okay, this was updated a few years back in 2011. And basically this goes through the whole highway patrol. This is if there's suspected wrongdoing, illegal activity by an employee. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward as to how you deal with that. And that's not something I'm going to get into great detail, except at the end of that, the initial police report must be electronically saved and attached to the asset record in Oaks AM or an agency in-house inventory system. Okay, and that was a policy that was enacted 2 years ago in September 8th of 2015. Okay, you don't have to take the entire police report, the final report. You just have to take the initial police report. Okay, and one of the things that I've experienced with the media requests is that the media doesn't really emphasize, or they don't really report their story that's on TV is not. It really doesn't have anything to do with something being stolen. They're more about making the powers to be look bad, as far as, hey, look what the state has done. Look at them. They haven't been able to keep track of their equipment, and they're wasting taxpayers' dollars. They don't really go after any story as far as something being stolen. It to my knowledge, it seems like, hey, if it's stolen, it's stolen, and you get a police report done, and then that's just kind of clear cut, unless it's a pattern. And if there's a pattern of things being stolen, if it's the same type of item or it's the same area, then they may dig in and do a story on it on the TV spot. But usually it's over the missing assets. Okay, so now we're still on the same page, but we're going into the cost threshold reporting criteria. Okay, so right there, the top there said the Department of Administrative Services, including Asset Management Services, that's us, in the General Services Division, responsibility ends, and the state agency's responsibility solely begins for state-owned assets not meeting the stewardship reporting criteria cost threshold for all state-owned consumable supply assets. Okay, so the requirement is for tangible assets. Okay, and also the cost threshold, as you'll see here in a minute, if we have a dollar threshold, let's say of $1,000, and you have a $300 item that you want to record in the asset system, you can. You can record anything you want in the asset system. Okay. You're still, and if you decide not to record that asset, it's still an asset. It's still the property of Ohio, and that's basically what this is saying. That even if you have some items that you own that aren't reportable assets in an asset system, you're still responsible for those items, including supplies. Okay, so that could mean anything from pencils to calculators to whatever. Okay, those aren't going to get entered into the asset system, but you are still responsible as a state employee for those items. Excuse me. Okay, so now I'm going on to page 8. And we are about halfway through. I'm going through this as fast as I can without rushing and missing some important information. So now we're getting to the threshold of different type of assets. So you'll see there at the top of page 8, for personal property, which is also considered equipment, the threshold is if it's greater than $1,000. Okay, the actual acquisition cost or the cost estimated cost during a donation, the threshold is greater than 1,000. Okay, that has to be inventoried, has to be recorded. Okay, then you get into section 2 with software. Software, the threshold is if it's greater than 100,000. Okay, and those are for bigger purchases. For instance, Oaks. Okay, something like that would definitely be an asset record in the system. Now, when you get to the third point there, all firearms, regardless of the cost, are required to be inventoried. the section number 4 there, this has to do with sensitive assets. So again, remember, we said it was up here at the front top. If it's more than 1,000, it needs to be inventoried. Okay, but then you have in section 4 where we're saying, hey, there's a subset of inventory that is considered sensitive, and that goes down to 500. Okay, and you'll see some of the categories there: audiovisual equipment, surveillance equipment. If it's $500, then you need to record those. And again, you can record anything you want. If you think something could be easily stolen, then you want to track it in the system, put a tag on it. You have that right to do that. These are just the minimum requirements. Okay, now when you get into number 5 there, highlighted in blue, this has to do with computing devices. And computing devices since 2008 have been recorded regardless of the cost. Okay, most of the phones these days, believe it or not, there's still a couple flip phones out there which are just phone. They don't have internet access. But for the most part, most of the phones have the email and they can store information. And so those are required regardless of the cost. We do have questions usually about the phones, okay? And some of the people have had really good questions about, okay, what happens if I have the contract with Moby where I pay for the phone and then the second time the phone is free, okay? So if it's a free phone, you're supposed to put the cost, fair market value cost. Now, the other side of that is sometimes the phones will be discounted. Okay. Well, if it's discounted, then you put the discounted price that you paid for the asset. But if you don't pay for the asset, if it's truly free, then you put the fair market value. Okay. The one thing you don't do is put in $1. And we've had some instances where people, they know they have to put something in the system. It has to be some kind of cost because cost is a required field. And so they'll put in $1. Well, unless they paid $1 for it, they shouldn't put in $1. It's whatever you paid for. And if it's donated, you have to find out the fair market value and put that in the asset system. Okay. Now, that we just talked about with personal property. Okay. Now we're going through real property. Okay. So now for those agencies who have land, and I understand not every agency does own land, but the land is required to be inventoried regardless of the acquisition cost. Okay. Same thing with easements. Whether it's an easement where the state is the grantee, or if it's an easement where the state is the grantor, those easements have to be entered into the asset system regardless of the cost. Now, on page 10, when you get down to number 4 there, the land improvements, if they're greater than 15,000, they have to be recorded. And that's, there's some examples there in the middle of the page of land improvements, such as parking lots, sidewalks, retaining walls, lighting, fencing, and some other structures that are on the land. Now, agencies may have a $10,000 land improvement. If they wish to put that in the asset system, they can. Okay, again, every agency has the right to put in whatever they want to, but they're required to put in their land improvements if the land improvement is greater than 15,000. Okay, so now when you get to number 5 there with the buildings, a building must be inventoried regardless of the cost of the building. And most most buildings are greater than 15,000 anyway. but there are some smaller shed type items, some storage items where they're still not quite 15,000. Well, in this case, it doesn't matter, because if it's considered a building, the requirement is regardless of the cost, the building needs to be recorded. Okay. Now in the middle of the page there, when you're talking about renovations, if the renovation to the building is greater than 100,000, it must be recorded as an asset. And so that, that again, we've had some agencies that have had $80,000 renovations to buildings, and they've gone ahead and entered them into the asset system, and then definitely have the right to do that. Okay, now we've gone through the cost thresholds for what is required to be inventoried, but we haven't. Now we're going to set. It's going to seem like we're doing the same thing, and I'm briefly going to go through this, but this is just for the capital assets. Okay, and for tangible personal property equipment, if it's greater than 1,000, it has to be recorded. But if it's greater than 15,000, it has to be coded as a capital asset. Okay, so you have a certain piece of equipment, and that number there in red on your screen, that is for the Oaks AM users. So if you use Oaks, you have some equipment that's greater than 15,000, you need to have a C on the end of that code. That code is called a profile ID. Most of you know it if you're doing entries in Oaks, but that profile ID represents what type of item it is, the 4 digits. But putting a C on the end represents that it's capital, and that profile ID field is what's used to pull the year-end reports that we run. Those reports are run and then sent over to OBM at the end of the year, and they use those numbers as part of that year-end report, the CAFR report. So it's pretty important to understand, if you have equipment, property that's greater than 15,000, you need to code it as a capital asset. Okay. There's no difference here as far as the software. The software still needs to be recorded at 100,000, and anything greater than 100,000 needs, if you're an Oaks AM user, it has to have the C on the end of that profile ID. The land, we said, was regardless of cost, so all land records are considered capital and need to be recorded as such. Easements, it's the same way. They're regardless of the cost, so you need to put a C on the easement records. With land improvements, again, it's the same threshold. If it's greater than 15,000, it has to be recorded, and it should be recorded as a capital asset. Now for buildings, again, there's the renovation records. Now again, we said all buildings, and this is one that's a little different. Earlier, we said buildings, regardless of their cost, need to be recorded. But if the buildings are greater than 15,000, again, most of them are, they would be recorded as a capital asset. And the same, it is the same for the renovations to buildings. If the cost is greater than 100,000, it should be recorded as a capital asset. Now, licensed vehicles. The licensed vehicles have to be recorded as capital, but the licensed vehicles are all in Fleet, Ohio. Okay, and so one of the changes this fiscal year is, even if you have a capital lease, okay, a capital lease, if you're leasing from DAS, then you don't enter the record. It goes through, it'll be DAS that's leasing from the company, so it's DAS's responsibility to record the asset, and they will record the asset in Fleet, Ohio. Okay, it does not get entered into Oaks AM, and that is something that's a little bit different. It sounds the same as in previous years, but we are recording the contracts for the lease vehicles. We are not going to continue to record the leases. So that there's number 7. So if it was greater than 15,000, which most vehicles are, it would be coded as a capital asset. Infrastructure, there's only 2 agencies that have infrastructure records, Natural Resources and the Department of Transportation. They're responsible for recording infrastructure records, and those are regardless of the cost on those. Now, number 9, sometimes we get confusion on that as far as construction in progress. Construction in progress does not get entered into an asset system. Construction in progress is until the project is done. Once it's done and operable, then depending on what it is, it can be entered into the asset system. But there are some, if the construction is still in progress, then those payments and everything associated with it goes on what's called a GAAP package, a general accounting principles. That is sent from OBM to the fiscal officers of each agency. And so the fiscal officers have to enter those construction payments as part of their GAAP package, but it doesn't get entered into an asset system until the project is complete. Are there any questions on that? No, it doesn't look like it. Okay, so.
Hey, Fred.
Yeah.
Fred, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Connie Melton has a question. She says, Connie's on the phone. She says, we have a question about the phones we just received. We were told to enter them as $1. What should we do to get the right cost?
Okay, so there should be some process in place that if, your internal process as far as somebody informed you, right, of the phones that were purchased, there should be some documentation that shows what you paid for them. Now, if there's not because you didn't pay for it, then that's when you would basically go online and try to do a Google search to try to find out the fair market value of those type of phones. And then you would enter that as your cost. But no, you should not enter $1. It should be the fair market value if you didn't pay anything. Now, if you did pay something, and you basically have to go back to your fiscal or your purchasing folks to find out, did we pay for something a little bit or did we not pay for these at all? Once you find that out, you can go one way or the other. You either enter the actual cost that you paid for it or do a search to try to find the fair market value, and that's what you would put in the cost for each of those phones. Michelle, did we have any other questions?
No.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to go to page 14. And I've already mentioned that as far as the construction in progress and the licensed vehicles. So we're getting close to the end of our policy here, the policy webinar. Now, one of the things that we've touched on. Yeah.
Fred, sorry to interrupt you again. There is another question just popped up.
Okay.
Destiny Hubert. She said, I have a question. I was told by Mike Moretti to tell APA to enter the phones as $1 due to the fact that we did not actually pay for the phone. We are paying for the plan.
Okay, but you're paying for the plan. Those should still be entered in as fair market value because they need to be depreciated accordingly. So, Destiny, those I understand what Mike told you, but the policy is in the case of this case that you would enter those at fair market value. not the $1 that he's mentioning. And if we need an offline meeting with DRC folks, would definitely can be, we can set that up to go over that, and we can have Mike involved, and we can have Wendell involved as well, so we can make sure that everybody's on the same page. So, Destiny, if you want to go further on that and you want to set up a meeting, just reach out to Michelle and I, and we'll try to make that happen. Okay, so back to the final page here. We have had some questions about attachments being purchased, attachments to existing assets, okay? And right there it reads, when an asset is acquired subsequent to the primary asset being placed into service, the new asset should not be associated with the primary asset by adjusting its cost. The attachment can be recorded as a child asset of the existing parent asset, or the attachment, the new item, can be recorded as a separate asset. Either way, the asset will have its own acquisition date, funding, and cost. Okay, and that's where we've had some folks who, let's say you had a $5,000 item, and then you bought some kind of attachment to something that costs $2,000. And what's happened in the past with some folks is they will go into that existing $5,000 asset and they'll do a cost adjustment of $2,000, and now it looks like the asset was $7,000. The problem with that is then that asset, the system thinks that asset should have been $7,000 from the beginning of time. So the depreciation goes back and plays catch up and says, oh, this is now a $7,000 item and needed to be depreciated accordingly over that time for the life of the asset. So it's not the proper way to handle an attachment. An attachment should have its own acquisition date, its own funding, and its own cost, so that it depreciates the proper way. So now, the nice thing about for the Oaks AM users is that you can do a parent-child relationship. So that means when you decide to retire, let's say the main asset, the original asset, it will give you a little pop-up window that says, hey, you have a child also that is associated with this main asset, this parent asset, and it kind of gives you a reminder, hey, if you're going to retire the parent, do you want to retire the child as well? Are you getting rid of the entire thing? Maybe you're sending it to state surplus, and that attachment is going with it. Or maybe in the case the attachment's not going with it, the attachment's going to, not be retired. You're still going to keep it, and maybe it gets attached to a different asset. So that's, in a nutshell, that's how you handle attachments to existing assets. Now down the next section there, interagency transfers. So it says authorization is required from state and federal surplus services prior to the asset being transferred between state agencies. Upon approval from state and federal surplus services, Oaks AM agencies must submit an Oaks Interagency Transfer Form, ADM 1448, and that should be sent to us at Asset Management Services. So whenever you want to get rid of an item, and most of you know this, whether it's going to be you want to transfer it to another agency or you want to send it to state surplus, you are in contact with surplus. They have the authority to sign off on items that go to surplus, items that get locally disposed, but also they have the authority over items that are going to be transferred between agencies. And I would say 99% of the time, they sign off on you sending it to another agency. I don't think there's very many times that they say, no, you're not sending that to another agency. We want you to send it to us so we can sell it at the auction. I don't think they do that very much, if at all. So you get the proper approval from state surplus, and then when you fill out the transfer form, you still have to get the receiving agency's permission as well. Michelle and I are the ones that have access to all business units in Oaks, and so that's why we need the information sent to us on a form, so we can actually perform the transfer transaction in Oaks AM. The agencies don't have access to transfer from one agency to another in Oaks. So, I mean, the agencies have the transferability to transfer chart fields from one chart field to another, say one department to another. That kind of intra-agency transfer, the agencies have access in Oaks AM to do that, but not for an interagency transfer where you're going to transfer to another business unit. And we won't do the transfer until we see documentation that says the receiving agency has agreed that they either already received it or they're going to receive it. We won't transfer until both the sending and receiving agencies are all in agreement that we should change that record. And then we have documentation on it. So if we get audited, we have the justification for changing those records. The final thing that we wanted to touch on today is regarding the custodian policy. Okay, now we sent something out, I want to say probably close to 2 months ago, about the requirement for equipment, and that all equipment records, it was required that you have a custodian. And we've had several inquiries regarding, hey, does it have to be a person's name, or does it have to be, can it be a unit or a division or an area, server team? Can we put server team? And so what we've done is we've reached out to some other states, especially states that use PeopleSoft, because then we know, hey, the custodian field is an existing field with these other states that use PeopleSoft. So what we've done is we've looked at the policies, see what they're doing, see what their requirements are, because the one thing I don't want to do is to put too much or not enough emphasis on this. I want to kind of piggyback off of some of the other agencies. So we're in the process of taking those findings and running it up our management team. And so we're not at the point of being able to say that we're changing the policy or not, because it still remains to be seen. But we are in the process of reviewing that and looking at the possibility of loosening up the custodian field just a little bit, so that agencies are permitted to put in, and I'm not saying to put in like a floor or room number. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying a certain group or a certain entity within your agency that it would benefit the agency, so they wouldn't have to put a certain person's name. Now, we all know that ultimately there's going to be a supervisor or a manager that is responsible for his group's equipment records. But because of some of the functionality with and some of the processes that certain agencies are going through with their IT groups, we decided we would look into this to see if we can loosen it up. And so what I would say is to stay tuned on that. As soon as if there is a policy change, then everyone in our database will get an email and showing the new change. We had a change almost a year ago where we had a couple agencies asking us about docking stations, and they were inquiring about why are docking stations required to be inventoried, because they don't technically compute. They're more for laptops, they're more of a charger than they don't compute and store information. And so after we looked into that some more, we were able to change that requirement so that docking stations are now not required to be inventoried regardless of the cost. So we do listen to agencies' inquiries, and if it makes sense and we get approval from our hierarchy here, then we do make changes. So we'll have to see on whether I can make a change on the custodian or not. But I just wanted everyone to understand that that is in the process of being reviewed. Michelle, did we have any other questions before we conclude?
So the only question was an OBM question. It was from Betsy Wagner. I did comment back to her and said we would get back to her individually, but I can read it. You want me to read it to you?
No, that's okay. We'll get back with Betsy, and that way we can make sure that she understands, and we don't keep the folks on the call that it may not pertain to them.
I do have one more from Jennifer Swallows.
Okay.
Just an FYI, our region puts floor numbers or areas, example, conference rooms, lobbies, etc., in the document ID tab. We also put custodian name in the same ID tab to keep location reports in alphabetical order.
Okay, so they use the document ID field for floor and room. Is that what that was saying? Floor and room?
Yes, yes. Put floor numbers or areas, example, conference room, lobby, etc., in the document ID tab.
Okay, yeah, and that document ID field is meant so that you could put whatever you needed to help you identify the asset. So yeah, floor and room number specifically are good for that. But what was the last part?
The other one, she said, we also put custodian name in the same ID tab to keep location report in alphabetical order.
Okay, so they're putting their custodian name in the document ID field?
Yes.
Wow, that's a lot of information, but they can put whatever they want in the document ID field. So as long as they're putting the custodian in the custodian name, last name, comma, first name, they're going to be fine during an audit. There's no requirement on that Oaks AM document ID field. We suggest floor or room number, but it can be anything in those 12 characters that helps the agency find their assets. Were there any other questions, Michelle, from anyone?
Looks like Marcia Skinner just sent something. She said, can you please go over the steps needed to take if an item does not get shipped to surplus but was listed?
Okay, so if the asset gets retired in Oaks AM, and I think, yeah, school facilities or facilities construction, they use Oaks. So yes, if you are going to send something to surplus and you go into Oaks and retire the record, and then you realize that you didn't ship the item, you need to do a reinstatement. Okay, and that reinstatement is it's a retirement reinstatement. It basically changes the status from disposed back to in service. And you should do that until the asset actually gets physically moved out, removed from your premises and shipped out to surplus. Once it's off your premises and shipped to surplus, then it should be retired. And in this case, the disposal code is retire by sale, because that's the one that's going, those items are going out to the auction to be sold. Good question. Any other ones, Michelle?
One more from Ed Ogborn. It
Okay.
says Commerce is about to receive some assets from manufactured homes. Just so I understand, the interagency transfer form is originated from the transferring agency, and that form will have to be approved by DAS surplus prior to receiving assets. But it doesn't have to be approved because of the...
Yeah, because there's a different situation. Normally, transfers have to be approved by state surplus. And Ed, you could still go that direction, where the folks at Manufactured Homes could send Amy Rice out at surplus the documentation that they want to, transfer the items over to Commerce. But in our policy, whenever there's a merger, technically you don't have to. So technically, by policy, Manufactured Homes would not have to reach out to surplus to get approval because there's a merger. Okay. But yes, Manufactured Homes needs to fill out the transfer form, and then you need to sign off on it as well. And then we get an email showing that both, maybe it's just an email trail, conversational trail, along with the actual form that says we both agree that these items are going to be transferred from MHC01 over to COM01. And once we get approval from both sides, then Michelle or I, one of us, will do the transfer in the system. And because that's happening, with all there's several commissions, boards and commissions that are merging with others. And this week, I've started to be invited on calls with OBM. And the big thing that we're talking about is when you shouldn't have us transfer something until the item is physically transferred. Okay, so if January 19th, which is the Friday before, January 21st, when this actually officially takes place, if you do it this month, that's not the proper time unless the item is actually already being shipped. So if the items are physically moved over to Commerce this month, then we can do the transfer this month. If some of those items, the employees are using those items all the way up until that Friday in January, then we have to wait until the items are physically moved before we do the transfer. Hopefully that made sense, Ed. If not, reach out to us offline, and we'll try to make that a little more clear.
Well, let me see. It made sense. Thank you. From Ed.
Okay. So
that's it.
So we had 149 people on the webinar, which is actually the most I think we've had in, I believe this is our 5th year doing this. So
actually, it was, Fred, it was 151 total.
Oh, we have more because we have people on in conference rooms and right.
Well, it showed 151 at first, and now it's 149. So a couple of people probably left.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So we will have a recording so we can tell all the folks who were online, so that everybody, every agency gets credit for attending the webinar. Again, if you were in a conference room or if you were in an office where you had several people that were listening in on the webinar, please let us know so that we can make sure that they get accounted for as attending as well. So it looks like there aren't any more questions. So I appreciate your time. We went a little bit over an hour, but hopefully you got the right information. And if there's any questions that come about later, please reach out to Michelle or I, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.